And the notes are on my own website. So the only note you really need, and this will help you to find the links and follow them later, is pwaldron.info/WSU 2026, uppercase WSU, it's case sensitive. So I call it Irish History, Memory, conversations during the day about history and memory. We didn't really touch on genetics yet. Can you read that down there, or do you want it slightly bigger? Can read it, I do. 1 or 2 pops bigger. The Irish history is part of world history. Whatever I say today, much of it is applicable to any other country in the world. The principles are universal. So I'm going to talk about how our culture was transmitted by our ancestors from place to place, from Ireland to America, for example, and down through the generations to us. And culture has many components: folklore, oral history, heritage, built heritage, castles and things that we saw earlier today, tradition, activities, going to the creamery in the morning or whatever, local history, the history of places, place names and so on, and genealogy, the history of people, stories of wars and countries, which you could call macro history. So the question is, how are these stories created? How are they nurtured? How are they transformed or corrupted? How are they contested? How are they reconstructed when they've been forgotten? Our ancestors wanted us to remember them. Some of them anyway. A lot of our contemporaries want to be forgotten. So I always start with this quote from a book by a historian whose mother came from North Kerry. Ahanagran is just across the river where we were looking from the lighthouse this morning. Richard White is a historian based in Stanford, and he turned his mother's stories and his effort to corroborate them from written historical sources into this book.
By the way, he's a very fine environmental historian, so this was a different tack for him.
Yeah.
To do a book like this is very personal.
So he said, I once thought of my mother's story, became a historian, and after many years I've come to realize that only careless historians confuse memory and history. History is the enemy of memory. The two stalk each other across the fields of the past, claiming the same terrain. History forges weapons from what memory has forgotten or suppressed. Few non-historians realize how many scraps a life leaves. These scraps do not necessarily form a story in and of themselves, but they're always calling stories into doubt, always challenging memories, always trailing off into forgotten places. We had a lot of chats today about, can you prove that? Is that just a tradition? Is it written down anywhere? Genealogy especially is about trying to turn the stories that have been garbled over the generations without being written down back into facts. And now we have genetic genealogy, done back about 25 years at this stage, and it's become very cheap now. Tradition, we have the written paper records, and we have what the DNA tells us, and they don't always agree with each other, and we have to learn how to trade off and figure out which is more true or more reliable than the other. And we have to figure out how to preserve history and memory and genetics of ourselves, our families, our communities, for us and posterity. Took that phrase off a tombstone. You see lots of old tombstone inscriptions around here, erected by so-and-so, for him and posterity, in memory of his father or mother or wife or whoever it might be. That's how our ancestors, in a lot of cases, preserved stories for us, or names, or whatever. How do we preserve history? Take notes. Keep journals, diaries, blogs. You're all keeping journals for Matt, I think, while you're over here. Memory, interview your elders. I recorded Bev last year with her stories about her great-grandmother who left here in 18. Record oral histories. I'll show you examples of that. You all have smartphones. They have voice recorders. They have video recorders. They have cameras. It was never easier to record stories. And when you talk to older people, if you're interested in genealogy, question 1 is, tell me about your parents. Let them talk. And then question 2 is, tell me about your grandparents. and tell me about your great-grandparents, and keep going until they get to the generation that they don't remember. It's easy to preserve our genetics. There's half a dozen big companies now with DNA comparison databases. Anyone in any of those databases? Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, Living DNA.
Very much worth doing.
And get your parents or your grandparents to do it, because we all have half of our father's DNA and half of our mother's DNA, and a quarter. And it's hard to separate out which bit came from your father and which bit came from your mother. So hopefully your parents are all still alive and you can persuade them to do it for you. Encourage the previous generations to do likewise. So how did oral history and tradition get passed on in Ireland? We talked about going to the creamery today and how that was the big social event of the day for the farmers. In the evening, the tradition was to visit other people's houses. There was no television. You didn't need to ring up on the mobile phone and say, are you at home? Can I call round? People just sometimes knocked on the door, sometimes walked in without knocking. And they sit around all night telling stories and tracing relations, tracing ancestors. The other, in rural farming Ireland, the creamery was one social event. The forge was another. Everything was done with horses. Horses needed to be shoed. You go and you queue up with your horse at the blacksmith's. I suppose in my family, my great uncle, Patrick McNamara, whose house I showed you today, he was a blacksmith. His brother was the farmer. His brother died young, so he had to come home and take over the farm, but he set up his blacksmith's forge, and he was both a farmer and a blacksmith, and that would have been common. Lots of people went to the pub to tell stories, to socialize, to pass on tradition. As I said, we've lost over 2,000 rural pubs in the last few years. So that's even dying out. And the church, the funeral was a big social occasion. The wake, which went on for 2 days sometimes. And there was drink taken. And that was where people would talk about whoever had died and their family before them. And that's where a lot of stories were passed on to the next generation. We go back hundreds of years, there were oral genealogies from before printing, before handwriting almost, that were handed down by word of mouth. Lauren and Rinalock, I can't even remember the year, back around 1500s or 1600s. And these oral genealogies traced people are documented in written sources in maybe the medieval times back to ancestors 10, 20, 30 generations earlier, a lot of whom are just maybe mythological, the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fir Bolg and people like that. So the very early generations, maybe you can't believe everything in them. And socially, it was important to have a good, well-documented genealogy going back many, many generations. And sometimes maybe they were invented. People tied themselves onto a family tree where they didn't really belong. So can't always believe it. There's in John O'Hart, whose son lived here in Kilkee, wrote many books on Irish pedigrees, and thanks to the Library Ireland website, we origin and stem of the Irish nations. So that was another early attempt to print all these traditional genealogies that had started out as oral history and been written down. More recently, Nuala Gomurla, who's an academic still working in Ireland, has edited Lauren and Rinalock, and that was republished in about 2004. And then when we had the connection between Britain and Ireland, or the takeover by Britain, or however you want to describe it, the families with peerages and landed estates and so on were documented in Burke's Peerage, Burke's Landed Gentry, what eventually became Burke's Irish Family Records, because by the 1970s, the proprietors of Burke's publishers realized, well, these people are no longer landed. The tenants now own the land, and maybe they're no longer gentry, and they're certainly no longer peerage, because the new Irish Constitution says we don't recognize any titles or peerages. So they just called it Irish Family. Didn't have aristocratic roots like the leaders of the new Irish state, the De Valera's and the Collinses and families like that. So they're great books for dealing with the upper echelons of society. For the ordinary people like you and me, folklore is preserved in lots of different ways. Have any of you looked at the school's folklore scheme? Yes? Matt knows about it.
Click the link. I then research.
In the early years of Irish independence, somebody came up with this brilliant idea of getting 11 and 12-year-old school children, because a lot of kids left school at that age, send them home to their parents, grandparents, neighbours, elderly relatives, and ask them to record local folklore with a whole list of topics to ask about. And the person in the school with the neatest handwriting was delegated to fill at University College Dublin, but it's also all online on this ducas.ie website, where you can browse or search, and God knows what you're going to find in there. Everything from traditions about holy wells, ancient saints, gossip about evil landlords, whatever. So well worth browsing and searching. You never know what you'll find in it.
It's an amazing resource. It's too bad it wasn't done more than once.
Yeah. And that's just part of the National Folklore Collection, which has lots of other stuff on its website as well. And it's open in Dublin to the public, and you can go in there and listen to audio recordings. They send folklore collectors around the country with all sorts of newfangled Ediphone machines or something they were called, early tape recorders starting in the 40s, if not the 30s. And they've preserved all those recordings and transcribed them. Cuimhneamh and Clore, the Clare Oral History Group for this county, set up by a great oral historian, Tomás Muckenmara, about 15 years ago, and now in the capable hands of Paula Carroll. And they've recently been able to hire 2 more archivists to help them to index and abstract and publish online 900 plus recordings that have been done over the last 15 years. Another county should have something similar. Matt knows all about Irish life and lore. This is the Kerry equivalent, a private enterprise by a married couple. Maurice and Jane O'Keefe. Sadly, Maurice died a couple of years ago. Matt can tell you the story about the new journal, to which he took out a lifetime subscription. But they have recorded not just the academic staff, but the ground staff and the gardeners and the porters and the cleaners, to get an oral history of what a university was like in Ireland 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. They have some incredible collections, but you have to pay for them. They're not all free online. But you get a little abstract of each, give you a taster of what they have. And there's even an Oral History Network of Ireland, which has its annual conference coming up in Chile in a couple of weeks, which I have to sign up for because there's a film being shown there in which I have a little part. So in that you can find genealogy, local and general history, stuff about music, superstitions and beliefs. As we said, there's hundreds of holy wells in every county. If you want to know about the holy wells in County Clare and all their traditions, that's on another website, the Irish Community Archive Network, run by the National local groups, to put information on this website. And Michael Houlihan, who worked in a chemical plant for his day job in County Clare for many years. When he retired, he became a tour guide in Scattery Island. And then his 2 passions were the holy wells and the Kilkee. And he's photographed and documented and written the history and collected the folklore about every holy well in Kilkee in County Clare. So that's another source that some of you might like to play with.
What's a Kilkee?
A Kilkee, literally, it's a little church. A kill is a church.
Mm.
I was going, it's somewhere later on in the notes, but we'll talk about it now since I'm on that. The church controlled the burial grounds. And then there was the Reformation, which complicated things. Mm. But the Catholic Church said, you should be buried in consecrated ground. Typically, only if you're in good standing with the church, if you've been baptized and are without sin. But if you're an infant who dies shortly after birth without being baptized, you're born with original sin. So you don't go to heaven, you go to limbo or purgatory or somewhere, and you're not allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. If you take your own life, that was considered a mortal sin. So you didn't die in a state of grace, you died in a state of sin. So if you were a suicide victim, they wouldn't allow you to be buried in consecrated ground. You'd be buried in the Kilkee. So it's kind of a graveyard for people that didn't make it into the consecrated ground. And there's one in every second townland in Ireland, probably, because infant mortality was huge before modern medicine. Or if a body was washed up on the shore and they didn't know whether it was a Christian or a heathen, the stranger's body would be buried in the Kilkee. Where were we? The other things you find in folklore: cures, farming practice, vernacular heritage, vernacular buildings as well, boat building. And actually the retired head of the National Folklore Collection is the son of somebody from just outside Kilkee, and he's now retired back to Kilkee. We see quite a bit of him, Christopher McCormick. His speciality is traditional boat building. I think the biggest book in my library is The History of Irish Traditional Boat Building by Christopher McCormick. It's about 800 glossy A4 pages with loads of nice pictures. This is from the Northern Ireland government on vernacular building heritage. All sorts of things, from galvanized roofs to where the chimneys go to the size of the windows. Things that were traditional and that have changed from over the years. You can look at that document and read about it yourself. But their houses were thatched. How the thatch was fitted onto the roof, how the straw was tied down to stop it blowing away in a storm. All that sort of vernacular building is being lost because now we're being told you have to build your house this way, you can't put a chimney in it, you have to mind the environment and so on. So to the genealogy thing, what are our online genealogy records? The government now insists that every birth, marriage and death be registered. That began in the United Kingdom in 1837, but it only applied to England and Wales. In 1855, it was extended to Scotland. Scotland introduced a wonderful system. When somebody married, the marriage certificate had the names of both parents of the bride, both parents of the groom. The English system was very sexist. Only the bride's father and the groom's father were named. That makes it harder to figure out who the mother was. The death certificates in Scotland in 1855, Ireland adopted the English and Welsh system. No parents' names and death certificates. In 2004, we caught up with Scotland. And now if you get a death certificate, it tells you the parents of the deceased. And that makes it easier to go back from generation to generation. And these were public records, because when somebody died, the estate, if there was no will, went to the next of kin. And the only way to establish the legal next of kin, the legitimate next of kin, was from birth, marriage, and death records. You had to prove that this person wasn't entitled to inherit because they were already dead, or that person was entitled to inherit because they were the legitimate offspring of the brother or sister, or that person wasn't entitled to inherit because they were illegitimate or whatever. So you could walk into an office and buy copies of these records. And then somebody got the great idea, we can put all the stuff online. And then all hell broke loose because of data protection legislation. And somebody decided that this law that had been there since 1863, when the law was passed, didn't matter anymore because we now have data protection law. You could still go into the office and pay your small fee for a paper copy of the record, but you couldn't see it online. There was actually a campaign run by one journalist working for the Irish Times newspaper who was paranoid about data protection. And then she went to work for the Data Protection Commissioner. But she caused such a fuss that all the records were pulled, and eventually there was a compromise reached. We can see birth records for anyone born within the last before the last 100 years, marriage records for any marriage that took place more than 75 years ago, and death records for anyone who's been dead for 50 years. And they release a new, even though the records were compiled on a quarterly basis, they wait until well after the end of the year to release 100, 75, 50 year. And you can search. Anybody got an Irish ancestor born over after 1864 that you want to look for a record of?
I'm looking right now for my great-grandma.
And what was her name?
Florence Sherman.
Florence Sherman.
She was born in 1915. We don't know where.
Sherman?
Yeah.
And born in Ireland.
Yes.
And these records cover the 32 counties up to 1922 and the 26 counties after that. So see, can we find her? No records found. Are you sure about the spelling?
Yeah, that's the spelling we have. We have her birth certificate. We have hers up to my great-great-great-grandma's birth certificate and death certificate. Where was she born?
And was she born in Ireland?
Yeah.
And what name is on the birth certificate?
We have Florence.
She coming up in 1915. You're sure Florence wasn't a middle name or anything?
What about Flossie? That was all we know.
We put in 1915. See, is there some spelling mistake or something in the index? What part of the country was she from?
Most popular from County Mayo.
County Mayo. It's Westport. Could it be registered in Westport? That's a Mary whose mother's birth name was Sherman. I don't know why we're not finding her, but she should be there. If you have the birth certificate and she's born in Ireland, something must have gone wrong in the indexing. Anyway, that's how it works. So I've told you. In the United States, you have a 72-year rule for census returns. The census is confidential up to 72 years after the date in which it's taken. So the censuses in the United States are taken in the years ending with 0. Here they've tended to be taken in the years ending with 1. And sometimes we have a census after 5 years rather than after 10 years. And there have been little glitches over the years with COVID and foot and mouth disease and things from the War of Independence. So we have lost all our census returns taken before 1901. The ones from 1821 to 1851 were stored in the Public Record Office in Dublin. In 1922, at the start of the Civil War, the Republicans took over the Public Record Office and dared the Free Staters, you're not going to attack this building because you'll blow up 800 years of Free Staters did attack the Republicans. The building went on fire. The fireproof barrier between the public reading room and the record repository worked perfectly, but the fire was on the wrong side. It was in the record repository. So all that survived were whatever readers had been reading in the reading room on the day that the rebels came in and took over the building. So we've no census returns before 1851. The later ones were pulped during a paper shortage. The 1901 and 1911 were the earliest surviving censuses. And eventually, by 1961, a politician with a very mixed reputation, Charles Haughey, was a very junior parliamentary secretary. He made the decision these records can now be made public. So from when that happened in 1961 until a few weeks ago, Irish genealogists did not have the pleasure of seeing a new census released to the public. The 1921 census didn't happen because of the War of Independence. In 1993, a 100-year closure rule was brought in retrospectively for all previous census returns. A long campaign to say you can't do that to us. You can't hide these records we've been looking for so long. We had to wait the full 100 years and 1 minute past midnight on the Saturday, the 18th of April, thousands or millions of Irish genealogists around the world were perched in front of their computers. And a whole team of archivists and technical people were perched around their computers in the National Archives, just hoping everything would work when they clicked the switch to let it go live. So this is the search form. And they told us everything is going to be available and searchable. And either they ran out of time or they said the website will crash if everybody's doing everything at once. So some of the fields are not yet searchable.
I was able to find 900.
Connolly, the same name as our new president. Any relation? Any relation of our new president, Catherine Connolly? You know the president is called Catherine Connolly?
I don't know. You might be related.
You might be.
He's like my 4th or 5th grade, I think.
And the president is from Galway. And Connolly is her maiden surname.
And everybody seems to like her.
Is that how she spells it?
Yes.
There's only 12.
She was born, we have her, she was born in 1881. Oh, sorry, 1820, sorry, she died in 1820. But I found.
Hang on, you said you found her in the 1926.
Yeah, I must have gotten the dates mixed up. There is another one that was born at the same time.
1926 census, unless they're 106. What part of Galway was she in?
We don't know. I could have to know. We have. She died in Wisconsin. That's where we have her certificate from. Does her husband give it to her?
Don't think you're going to find her in 1926, but what do you find? We look at the oldest one. We look at the 68-year-old, and you can actually see the original form. And it's going to be hard to read on the small screen because it was a very big form. This Catherine is the wife of Thomas Connolly, and she has a son and a daughter. They filled in the English side of the form. The back of the form was in Irish for those who wanted to fill it in the Irish language. They did nice things like asking not only for the county of birth, which the earlier ones had asked for, but for the actual townland or town people were born in. What was your first language and your second language? So the parents' first language was Irish and their second language was English. The children didn't have any Irish. So this is the period at which the Irish language was dying out. What was the occupation? Who did they work for? So on. So that's a fantastic help. We've been waiting for 65 years for a new census. We finally got it. And DNA is fantastic. If you get a list of DNA matches who are somehow related to you, ordered by the ones at the top are those who share the most DNA with you. So if your parents or children are in the list, they'll be at the top, or your siblings, and then cousins of various degrees. And it can pick out relationships about 10% of your fifth cousins. And that can help to go back before the written records. The general principles, two big mistakes that everyone makes. If you find two records relating to different people with similar names, a lot of people would jump to the conclusion that's the same person. You wouldn't think there's only one John Smith in New York today. But don't think there's only one Catherine Connolly in Galway either, because we just saw there were 12 of them. So be very careful when you find the name you're looking for, that everything else matches as well. The reverse side of that coin is there was no standardization of spelling. People didn't remember their ages and so on. So you can have what looks like two different people. If it's Duggan with one G or Duggan with two Gs, don't say they're different people, because there was no right or wrong spelling. Just I'm going to talk about the 5 basic parts of genealogy: the names, the dates, the places, the sources which are critical, and the family history, the family folklore that you add to all of that. We have very old surnames in Ireland, almost before anywhere else. There are countries and cultures that have only adopted hereditary surnames in the last 100 years or so. The origins of most surnames are patronymics. The surname comes from the father. So the O'Briens claim that their surname is the oldest in Ireland. Brian Boru was the High King who was killed at the Battle of Clontarf in the year 1014. And the first O'Briens were his grandchildren. The O prefix means grandson of. And some surnames, there are so many of them that you need some other distinguishing factor. We passed two. There were two Michael McNamara's living a mile apart on the same road. And how do you distinguish one Michael from the other Michael? Well, one might be called Long Michael or Tall Michael because he was 6'4", and the other one is 5'2", and he might be Small Michael. Or Tall Michael was the son of Anthony, and Small Michael was the son of Patrick. So you use a new patronymic. You call the tall one Michael Anthony, and the small one Michael Patrick. That's not a surname. That's a patronymic, but it's not hereditary. It's only going to last one generation. And common surnames like Ryan, O'Sullivan, Durkin, my mother's surname, they do have a cognomen, another name that does pass on through the generations. Everyone in Tipperary is called Ryan. So you have the Ryan Lukes and the Ryan Wills and the Ryan Larrys and the Ryan Darbys. And the official surname is Ryan, but they all carry that cognomen with them through the generations. To DNA with 4 different inheritance paths that we use in 4 different ways for genealogy. Men have a Y chromosome, and 1 Y chromosome, 1 X chromosome. Women have 2 X chromosomes. And every man gets his Y chromosome from his father, and most men get their surnames from their father. So the Y chromosome goes down with the surname from generation to generation. So you can use that for surname studies. And sometimes you'll find a surname where all the men with that surname have matching Y DNA. There'll be a mutation of the Y chromosome every 2 or 3 generations. And after hundreds of thousands of years, there's a wide genetic diversity in Y chromosomes, and you can map them onto surnames. But you find most surnames have a lot of different genetic origins for various reasons. It might be an occupational surname like Miller or Smith, and every Miller is descended from somebody who operated a mill. And then you have surname DNA switches for whatever reason. The child takes his mother's surname rather than his father's surname. A will says, I bequeath to my nephew or my cousin all my property on condition that he adopt my surname. Lots of exceptions to the rule that the surname follows the Y chromosome. We all also have mitochondrial DNA, which is like the female equivalent. It goes from mother to child. So my mitochondrial DNA came from my mother, and then her mother, and then her mother, and then her mother. You can't do surname studies with that because the surname changes in every generation as you go down the mother to daughter line. So it's slightly less useful for DNA. I talked earlier today about the language problem. Irish language and there's no consistency of spelling. There were no right spellings or wrong spellings of names of people or places. They're just different spellings. The idea of using the same spelling every day is very modern. Where did our English language versions of our Irish surnames come from? Naturally, being a Waldron, I like to look at when did that surname first appear in Ireland. The earliest record I can find is in 1609. The plantations of Ulster and other parts of the country were going on at that stage. A well-documented English family was planted in County Cavan and spread out from there over the centuries that followed. I would love to be able to use Y-DNA to see is that my family, but on this pedigree going back to the 1300s, the surname has daughtered out There's been no long path of father to son. And I've ended up having no children or only having daughters, and the surname is gone. And I've no why DNA matches, no close ones, other than my second and third cousins. So possibly they are my ancestors. But there were names in the area in Irish, like Muck Waldron and De Waldra. It sounded a bit like Waldron. So what often happened was probably an English person or an English speaker recording the local people heard an Irish name and said, this is the closest English name, we'll give them that English name. You can tell by the start of the surname what its origin is. The Gaelic Irish surnames, they used Mac, meaning son, and O, meaning grandson, as prefixes. There are a lot of Mac names in Scotland as well, because Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic languages are very similar. The Norman prefix was fils, which is related to the French word fils, F-I-L-S, meaning son of. They're all surnames of descendants of the Norman settlers of Ireland. And there's a wonderful book which you can find on the Internet Archive about the numerous different ways in which many Irish surnames were turned into English. So you've names like Conneen. Conneen is the Irish word for a rabbit. So there are people with the surname Rabbit and people with the English surname Conneen, C-U-N-N-E-N. But that's the same family, it's just been translated differently. You've Shinnick and Fox. Shonnock is the Irish for a fox. So some people with the surname Shonnock in Irish became Shinnick because it was just transliterated. And some people became Fox because it was translated. So beware of all those things. Christian names are the same. There's lots of variation. With a father or an accent on the O. In English, sometimes it's written with a H on the end, sometimes without. Sometimes it's short for Honora, or Honor, or Hanora, or Hanoria, which might be the Latin version you see in the parish records. And then you'll have another Hanoria, might be shortened the other way to Hannah rather than to Nora, or Hannah with a H, or Hannah with only one N, or Anna with no H at all, or Anne with only one A, or Anne with an E on the end. And sometimes a Johanna was shortened to Hannah or Anna or Hanny or something as well. And then you more Johannas, and their nickname is Josie. And then you have Josephines, whose nickname is Josie. And then Josephine in Irish is usually Siobhan, but Siobhan is sometimes also used in the Irish for Susan, or even for Judy or Judith. And Judith is sometimes Julia, and Julia is Sheila in Irish. So you're not going to get all those names applied list used in different records for the same person, because these are people speaking Irish in their everyday life and being recorded in English and Latin in other records. You've also got to know the nicknames, the diminutives. My legal name is Patrick, but everyone calls me Paddy. Some Margarets become Maggie or Mago or Meg, but they also become Peg and Daisy. So in those cases, the nicknames don't look anything like the full name. Bridget in Latin becomes Bedelia, and Bedelia gets shortened to Delia. An awful lot of Americans in particular have no idea that Delia is the same thing as Bridget. And Bridget or Biddy were kind of derogatory names for Irish servant girls working in the East Coast of the States in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So there's a cousin of mine from Texas visiting Ireland at the moment, and her great-grandmother, before she emigrated, she was Bridge Tom Worching, or Morching, and there were so many Durkins in the townland, they all needed these patronymics. And Bridge Tom Morton, when she went to America, she didn't want to be Bridget or Biddy. She became Beatrice, which was the posh version of Bridget. So changes happened when people emigrated for all sorts of reasons. Jack was traditionally a nickname for John. Now Jack is a more common name than John. And sometimes you see John Jack or Jack John, with one as the first name and the other as a middle name. Elizabeth becomes Lily or Lily. Timothy becomes Thady, which is more like the Irish, which is Tig. One that I only learned late in life, Darby. and Jeremiah are the same. Jeremiah in Irish would be Dermot or Dermot, and Darby is a bit like Dermot. Lots of Marys become Minnies and Mollys. Anne's become Nancy's.
We were looking for Jeremiah, and the priest said, "Oh, there it is in the book." The priest was helping me. I said, "It's not Jeremiah, it's Dermot." He said, "Yeah."
Same thing.
Everybody knows.
With the late Chris O'Mahony at one stage, and he came to a name in the record and he said, "There's Morgan." And I said, "What?" Because it said Pelagius, which is the Latin for Morgan. Still haven't figured out that.
Search you have to learn.
And the handwriting is very different. And the one good thing about AI is there is now some fantastic AI reading of old handwriting that you and I would struggle with. A lot of these records are indexed by people from other cultures who are not familiar with all these niceties. So you're looking at indexes that do not reflect the original. And we are two continents separated by a common language. I bet you've all learned at least one new word every day you've been in Ireland, or an old word that means something completely different in Ireland. And pronunciations also diverge. So that first surname there, how would you pronounce? Mahoney is closer. The original Irish is Mahuna. Mahoney is what we say today. Mahoney is what most Americans say.
I went to grammar school with Nancy Mahoney. I told her at a reunion, it's probably Mahoney, and we were probably related.
And who knows which of today's pronunciations is closer to what the immigrant pronounced it as. The second one?
Costello?
Americans say Costello. The Irish say Costello, with the emphasis on the first syllable. The next one?
Doherty? Doherty?
Doherty is the Irish. Doherty or Doherty would be more of the American. And even in Ireland, O'D and O'Day can be spelled both ways and can be pronounced D because it's DEA, but it could well be pronounced O'Day as well. It's good. Spelled DEA, but pronounced DAY. Yeah. And then the other myth about names is that immigrants' names got changed at Ellis Island. That's not true because the passenger lists were compiled at the port of departure, not at the port of arrival. So the name in the Ellis Island records is the name that was written down at the departure port. And there are lots of other explanations as to why you have different spellings. We don't have the convention of having a single middle name in Ireland. I'm Patrick Joseph Martin Waldron. I have 4 names. So the middle is after the first 2 and before the last 2. You can't call any of those a middle name. But that was unusual even when I was born in the 1960s. Apart from the very posh, didn't have middle names until well into the 20th century. But then they go to America and they're expected to have a middle name and they have to make one up. We've talked already about patronymics and how you might be Michael Anthony McNamara because your father was Anthony. That man would emigrate and he'd become Michael Anthony and Anthony would be his middle name. Then we have the naming patterns. It was traditional for a very long time that the first 2 sons would be called after the 2 grandfathers, and the first 2 daughters after the 2 grandmothers. Some people say there was even a particular order as to which grandfather or which grandmother was remembered first. The 3rd child of each gender would be called after the oldest uncle or aunt. That's often a great help if you're not sure which family of the same surname you're looking for in the same area. Some people tell me it's very whether you end up with lots of Connor Keens. But if you end up with 2 Connor Keens of roughly the same age living in the same area, it's very likely they're both called after the same grandfather and their first cousins. So it can be a big help. You've got to make sure when you're looking at multiple people with the same name, that you keep the date in mind all the time and you don't confuse people from different generations.
So how does the pattern work with women? Is it the mother's mother first and the father's mother next? Typically?
I have seen it both ways round.
Yeah.
And I'm reluctant to say anything is typical. So there's my example. My great-great-grandmother was Catherine Parker, daughter of Thomas and Mary. So she called her second son Thomas after her father and her first daughter Mary after her mother. And the other son and daughter were Edward and Jane. So I don't know what Thomas Waldron's with a wife Jane, and I found an Edward Waldron with a wife Jane in the right place at the right time. There's lots of pedigrees of that family, and they have only one son, and he's Francis, and he's not Thomas. And I have tiny DNA matches with descendants, relatives of Edward, but none with relatives of Jane yet. I got another one a few weeks ago, but it still hasn't helped. So the jury is out on whether they're my great-great-great-grandparents or not. How are we doing for time? Little time left. So I'll try and speed up. Before civil registration began in 1864, we have to rely on church records. And church records include sponsors at baptisms and witnesses at marriages. And they're usually either close relatives or next door neighbors. The sponsors, nowadays we call them the godparents. A quaint old word for them was the gossips. If you look at those names, they'll often provide you important clues. There was a very strict tradition that the marriage always took place in the bride's home parish because the priest had to be paid a fee for the wedding, and he didn't want it going to the priest in the neighbouring parish. The very posh people I talked about, the priest I used to visit whose parents were married by Father Meehan, and he didn't marry them in his own parish. He travelled to Dublin with them so that they could have a posh wedding and a posh reception. But they brought the priest with them, and the fee for the marriage went back to the home parish. Sometimes you saw grandparents as godmothers. Sometimes you saw godmothers down under their maiden surname. And we talked about Killeens already. Birthdays. Very important lesson about birthdays. I got this wonderful letter from a cousin in America at one stage. In America, and the son wrote home and said, I need to know my birthday, my birthdays, and he didn't know it. And the next most likely person to know it, presumably, was the mother, who was obviously there on the occasion. And the mother wrote back and said, I can't remember exactly when you were born. It was the spring of the year. It might have been 1851 or 1852. I could go and ask the priest to check his books for me, but he's collecting money for his new church and I'm dodging him at the moment. So does anybody remember being born?
Yes, I can. No.
If you read Frank McCourt, Angela's Ashes, he claimed he remembered things that happened in the womb before he was born, but he was unique. People didn't know when they were born because they never bothered to ask. There were no birthday cards until 1908. And people didn't care because there were no pensions. There was no old age pension until 1908. People will be asked later in life on census returns and marriage records and on the death records of deceased relatives, what age was the bride or what age was the deceased. You can't place any credit on a lot of those numbers. It's not that people were lying, that they just genuinely didn't know, didn't need to know, and didn't care. So even if you plot the ages on census returns, you'll find everybody rounds to the nearest 10 years and you'll have a big peak at 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50, because people didn't know to the nearest year when they were born. There's a lovely piece that I've linked to there about the old age pension. My great uncle, my grandfather's identical twin brother, and my namesake, both twin brothers worked in the post office. The pension was distributed through the post office. Uncle Paddy wrote for the post office employees magazine called The Oracle, was it? The Oracle. So this is a scan. The old age pension scheme occasioned no small amount of interest in Irish post offices. On the first day, the various offices were fairly besieged by claimants who had reached the allotted age. It was 70 at that stage in 1909. So 70 years before that was 1839. Ireland being noted for the longevity of its people, it is not surprising that something like 180,000 claims are anticipated by the authorities, or that already several applications have been received from persons over 100 years of age. These latter have a genuine cause of complaint in that Mr. Lloyd George was not Chancellor of the Exchequer 30 years ago when they turned 70. While assisting the illiterate and most of the applicants were of this class to fill up the forms, I received a lot of interesting information about early 19th century events in which the narrators took part or of which they were witnesses. Very few of these links with the past knew the exact date by reference to some important event which formed a landmark in their lives. For instance, one old man who could at first give no more particulars than that he was Bertie Crabbit added that he heard it said he was born the week of the Clare election, meaning the keenly contested election of Daniel O'Connell for Clare in 1828, the first Catholic elected to the United Kingdom Parliament. Another claimant told his age by recounting that when a boy, he saw hundreds of people starting to walk from the north of Tipperary County to Cork over 100 miles to take the pledge from Father Matthew, the pledge to abstain from alcohol, part of the temperance movement. That would have been in 1838 when the Apostle of Temperance commenced his crusade and before he had extended it beyond the city of his adoption. Pitiable it was to listen to people who had actually suffered in the awful famine of 1846-7 when thousands of Irish fell victims to hunger and disease. The sufferers in it makes one's blood freeze. And as a matter of fact, almost all of the Irish applicants have the record of having lived through a plague from which death would have been a happy release, and to such as have suffered 5 shillings a week pension is not a too liberal allowance. So that's what life was like 117 years ago. So we rely on church records where they exist. We have what we call the dark 18th century, where the penal laws were in place. Most of the population were Catholic. The priests were on the run. They certainly found it very difficult to keep any records. And when you're on the run, you're not going to be carrying the parish registers around with you all the time. Eventually, Catholic emancipation came in 1829. Parish records get better after that. They're good in the city. Devotional revolution with lots of new church building, much better church records. The whole picture changed again. I've said enough about the famine, I think, in that extract. And you heard more about it, lots about it on our tour earlier today. The revolutionary period, what has that got to tell us about records? The main thing is the destruction of the Public Record Office in 1922 and the loss of records. There was this project started before the centenary called Beyond 2022. I clicked on that website earlier to see what's going on. It's now a casino website because they've changed the name from Beyond 2022 to Ireland's Virtual Record Treasury. It's a slow and painstaking process of looking for copies that people might have made of the records that were in this building. There's a virtual reality tour. It's not the most user-friendly website, I'll just say that about it. But if you're looking for a record that went up in smoke in 1922, somebody might have found a copy and it might be on that website. Place names. I talked about townlands on the bus earlier today. They were mapped and given standardized English language spellings by the Ordnance Survey between 1824 and 1846. And those maps are online and they keep being moved around. But the best version is, it's already diverting. It used to be called maps.archaeology.ie. Now diverting to heritagedata.maps.arcgis.com. So we can put in something like Kilkee here. Can we find where we are this evening? There's lots of Kilkees and place names containing Kilkee. So if I click on that, it jumps to a present day map of Kilkee. All these blue dots are protected buildings. The red dots are archaeological sites. The green lines are the townland boundaries. Townland names are written in green. But there are many base maps that you can use. So we'll find the Stella Maris. Where are we? Here where my cursor is. Now I need the cursor to go somewhere else. So I'm going to put my finger on my screen so that I know where to put the cursor back to. We can go all the way back to the first edition map from 1840. So that's roughly where we are. This row of houses looks like it was there in some form, but the seawall, the famine relief scheme hadn't been built. You just have rough sand dunes along here. So Curry Street has a but the strand line along the seawall is not there yet. The centre of town is over here on Grattan Street on the other side of us. The new Protestant church has just been built. The new Catholic church has just been built. But it's a very small little village scattered around the bay and a commercial heartland over at this end. And then we can move on about 60 years to the 25-inch map. This one is in black and white, but you see things have now changed. We can zoom in to even higher resolution. And now you can see the houses all along the seafront. It's walled in. The Stella Maris Hotel is already marked. This hotel was here under this name 130 years ago. This is still Francis Street. It became Grattan Street after Henry Grattan, an Irish leader in the late 1700s. Albert Road still has its old name. Queen Street became O'Connell Street. Probably change more than the geography. It's all there for you to play around with.
Which side is that?
That is the way I got into it. The easiest one to write down is maps.archaeology.ie. But the link is there on my notes page anyway. The Clare Library has its own version of that. And now we have air codes. You've been using air codes to navigate. You have a driver. You don't need to navigate with air codes. This came in about 2015. So the air code of the hotel is V15EV88. You bung that into Google Maps. In this case, it gives you your little red pin right where the hotel is. Where's my cursor gone? But you don't need to tell it Stella Maris or Erin Street or Duke or anything else. It finds it just by the postcode. That's how we all navigate nowadays. And each mailbox, there are hundreds of houses in each 5-digit zip code, and I think even the 9-digit zip codes contain multiple houses. So I think it's a pity that we have lost place names that were many, many centuries old, if not millennia old, for a meaningless set of letters and numbers like that. I'm rushing now because we're gone over the hour. Just picking out the highlights to show you. Another brilliant website is loganim.ie, which gives you all the official Irish language and English language place name spellings for everything from townlands up to counties. And it also has a subsection for field names and minor place names, the sort of things that are only passed on orally and have never been written on maps. And it's probably not going to load properly. In Irish. It worked the second time. So what am I going to search for here? I'm trying to think. I'll search for Norway. Anybody know where Norway is?
What I think.
I'm totally disoriented down here now with no windows. I don't know what way we're looking. Norway is a local place name just outside Kilrush. It's not the country. oh no, this isn't going to work for me either. But if you go through the old parish registers, you see a couple of births every year with the address down as Norway. If you walk down the street in Kilrush and ask a local today, where's Norway? They say, oh, that's over in Scandinavia. It's only a mile out the road. So these names that existed and were ignored by the Ordnance Survey have died out. I'm not going to waste time trying to get that website to work. I promise.
For you.
It's for volunteers, a mehel. The mehel was the concept of all the neighbours coming together to do the farm work together. So when you were saving the hay, you do one farm's hay today and you give your neighbour a day or 2 days labour, and then the next day he'd give you 2 days labour in saving your hay and so on. So it's a cooperative effort to get people with local knowledge all over the country to write down these place names and put them on the map before they're forgotten. We talked all about the land war when we were in the walled gardens, about the Vandeleurs yesterday. I talked about Kilkee earlier. Sources are something that I need to say a lot about. Lots of genealogists nowadays are seduced by companies like Ancestry, which says, come and register on our website, tell us. And then that gets recorded as your personal effort as a family tree. And then somebody comes along in a year's time, and that guess that you've made that might be completely wrong without checking any sources or adding any sources is being sold on to these people as a hint. So a mistake goes viral very quickly. And sadly, we have to go back and start all over again looking for primary sources. So you have to challenge the online family trees that are out there today in the same way that you challenge any oral history that doesn't have paper documentation behind it. Document all your own sources. When you find information, write down where you got it, because in a day's time or a week's time or a year's time, you'll have forgotten where you got that information. I'm a big fan these days of collaborative genealogy. You have a number of single world trees where instead of Ancestry telling you set up your own standalone tree. So Wikitree is one of three. I think it's the best because of its emphasis on sources. So if I go to my own profile, it will show you my Ancestry. Is that loading? It's not loading for some reason. We click again. Now it's loading. So it gives lots of blurb about me at the top, which you don't want to see. And there's my pedigree chart with my 2 parents, my 4 grandparents, my 8 great-grandparents, my 16 great-great-grandparents. The idea is that everyone who ever lived has one profile on this tree, and all the relatives or descendants of that person cooperates on recording the facts and writing the biography. So if I go back to my Thomas Waldron with the unknown parents, I haven't connected him to Edward or Jane. I could put them in and mark them as uncertain. I haven't quite been that confident yet. Search notes. So I've been working on his family tree for as long as I can remember. So I've got 11 sections in the biography and a research strategy for what else to do. And it allows you to put in footnotes and links at the end to the original sources. So all those footnotes are generated from code within the biography. So I encourage you, add your own family tree to that. Connect up to whichever cousins are already researching. So we're really over time. So I'll let you read most of this on your own. Let's give you a little mathematics lesson. We've no mathematics majors in the room. Nope. We have. Anyway, it's very simple arithmetic. We all have 2 parents, at least 2 biological. Surrogate parents, everything nowadays. We have 4 grandparents. We have 8 great-grandparents. We have 16 great-great-grandparents. 2 to the power of n in every generation. You only have to go back 10 generations and you have 1,024 ancestors. And each of those, another 10 generations back, had 1,024 ancestors of their own. So 20 generations back, we have 1 million slots to fill on our family tree. 30 generations back, that's about 900 years, we have 1 billion slots to fill. That's probably more than the population of the world 900 years ago, probably way more. So there's going to be a lot of repetition in there. So in fact, anyone who was alive 1,000 years ago with descendants alive today is almost certainly the ancestor of everybody alive today. A lot of people alive 1,000 years ago have no descendants. You might not say that on a worldwide basis because there are populations we didn't have much contact, but certainly within a continent, you can say that we all share the same ancestors. We all share the same cousins. Some of them are just closer to us than others. So I've given you a few numbers there of how many of my own close relatives I've traced out to my fifth cousins, 15,000 people already in my database. And it grows and grows and grows. So we are all related. I would say in some place like County Clare, there's a 95%. In Ireland, there's a 95% chance that any two people that you meet in the street are 12th cousins or closer. If you narrow that to a county, maybe you could say 7th or 8th cousins.
There's a little trick on if you're on Family Search and people around you are on Family Search, you just press a button, relatives near me. When my wife taught a family history class in the honors college, the last day of the class, she
Blood related.
Yeah.
Right. And WikiTree has a similar relation finder and connection finder and categories and so on. And the last thing that is being peddled by these genealogy companies that I don't like is the notion of ethnicity. I think it perpetuates ethnic and racial divisions. If I'm asked in a census, what race do I belong to? I say the human race. That's the only race we belong to. The numbers that they are selling, the estimated ethnicity percentages, are not very reliable. If they're under 10%, they're not significantly different from zero. If you publish an opinion poll, certainly in this country, you have to say what's the margin of error. So a party with 2% of the vote and a plus or minus 3% margin of error may as well not exist. The margins of error in these ethnicity percentages are higher. And anyway, what do they mean? Is your later in life on what language they spoke? Or are they dependent? Is it dependent on the reference populations used by the DNA companies? They typically look for people who can prove that their ancestors lived within a small area for 3 or 4 or 5 generations. So really what ethnicity is telling you is where your cousins about 3 times removed from the reference population live today. You have people with different ethnicities who intermarried. What ethnicity do you give them if you're looking 300 years later? People migrated from one place to another. What ethnicity label do you give them? A lot of these people moved around with no international borders. They spoke languages that are no longer spoken where they lived. They've left no trace in written or oral history. How do you decide what their ethnicity was? Is ethnicity supposed to be where your advanced ancestors lived 1 generation back, where they lived 5 generations, 25 generations back? You're going to get very different answers depending on which time period you're looking at. And there's an out of Africa theory, which is widely accepted, that all human beings descend from the first humans who lived somewhere in Central Africa about 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. So if we go back 300,000 years, we're all 100% African ethnicity. But the great thing about DNA comparison is it gives you a list of your closest relatives in the DNA database. It helps you break down brick walls. It's a big help to adopted people who've no idea where to start. And now it's been used for the last 10 years probably with DNA from crime scenes to try and identify the criminal by building his family tree and finding out the same way as you would find out who the ancestors of an adoptee was, but now you're starting with crime scene DNA. send off your DNA, get it into the database, but use it to look at your list of cousin matches and forget the ethnicity labels. Anyway, that's my waffle for tonight.
I have a question. I can't speak for Ancestry.com or a lot of those guys. I know certain. I know a lot of them are very Mormons. Like I said, I can't speak with people who actually do it, but I know a lot of Mormons who completely ignore their Black relatives. I was just wondering, is that something you come across often?
Um,
So I feel like it's a tough question.
I can't say that I've come across it. I'm sure I have come across people who would be racist like that and would ignore Black relatives. Yeah. But hopefully those attitudes are less prevalent than they were a few generations in the past. Any questions?
I have a DNA question. I know, like, we're all involved with that, but I had a question, like, if you have a deceased family member, so you can't get their DNA, obviously, from the same way that we would with our spit or saliva, can you do it from their ashes?
I don't think you can do it from ashes. I think cremation destroys the DNA.
Okay.
You might be able to do it from the root of a hair or something, or from a tooth.
Roots Tech, they were talking about, where there's more than one company now that they want to use envelopes.
Yes, there was a company called To the Letter or something, but I think that folded. But sorry, no pun intended.
There was one that this year that seemed to be up and coming.
Well,
Of course, who licked that?
off my DNA back in 2013. My top match was this lady here, Anthea Ring. And she was left on a hillside to die as a baby with her 2 front teeth. I think we now know she was about 9 months old, and her hands were tied behind her back with a strip torn off the hem of her dress. There were family out picking blackberries, and they heard crying in the blackberry bushes, and they looked, and there was this baby. So the picture on the left is the baby picture that was published in the newspapers when they looked for where are her parents or who abandoned her. She's now a great grandmother and lovely lady. So I did my best to help her. I got my first cousins on each side to send off their DNA so we could see was she related on my father's side or my mother's side. Turned out to be on my mother's side. And eventually, I think I got it down to who her great grandparents were. And then a search angel, an adoption angel called Julia Bell in England. And eventually she was able to identify Anthea's mother. And on the other side, she narrowed down Anthea's father to one of 2 brothers. And neither of them had any other known children at the time. But one of their nieces had a collection of letters written by one of the brothers. And Living DNA, an English DNA company, said, we have the technology to extract DNA from the seal of the envelope and identify who licked the envelope. And the man who licked the envelope turned out to be Anthea's father.
That's wild. That's crazy.
Yeah. And subsequently, a paternal half-brother showed up. So he was actually carrying on with 2 women at the same time. There was only a few months between the 2 children.
Able to help with that.
Yeah.
Super.
Patty helped my wife help her daughter. You know, her secret. And took a year, but with Patty's help, she found it.
So cool.
So,
She went and met cousins and all kinds of stuff.
Do you have any tips on how to read cursive?
say that again?
Do you have any tips on how to read cursive handwriting?
How to read cursive handwriting. Feed it into Gemini AI. I don't know what you even call the old secretary hand or something that was used in legal documents 200 years ago. I can't read any of it. I fed it into Gemini AI and I got a perfect transcript in seconds.
I was thinking too, when you were talking about the the idea that not everything's accurate, because on the log, well, you were talking about like on the ship log, how that could determine at Ellis Island that where they were from, because I know like from my dad's great grandmother, I found out that she was from Northern Ireland, but they had her from Liverpool because they put everybody from Liverpool because that's where the ship left from. So like our family or his family, my cousins thought, oh, well, this grandmother's from England. Well, she wasn't. That was the only ship she could come over on.
And when I was talking to this cousin who's over from Dallas last night and her young husband, and he told me his Irish ancestors came from Cork. And I said, well, most Irish people came from Cork because that was the main transatlantic embarkation points for the big transatlantic liners for many decades.
Yeah.
And you've got, if that's the family tradition, you've got to make sure that, I was born in Cork rather than I sailed from Cork,
Yeah.
which are two very different things.
Well, thank you
Yeah.
very, very much, Patty, for lots and lots